Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts on a popular topic amongst endgame players in Final Fantasy XIV right now, the 2-minute buff window. Now, going into Endwalker, we were told that job design was going to be shifting into very regulated buff windows. While jobs still had maybe an off global on 30 seconds or some sort of big 1-minute ability, with a couple of jobs having 90 seconds in there for whatever reason, a lot of the jobs are going to be balanced around these very regulated 2-minute buff windows. Almost all of your skills should line up with that, and everybody should be able to pump out as much damage as possible during those times. Now, we had some initial reservations about homogenizing the buff windows very heavily like this, but we decided to give it a chance, like we do with everything else in Final Fantasy XIV. At this point, though, we have a couple of savage tiers, even if one of them was a little bit contentious, I think we can say fairly, and an ultimate under our belt, plus all the other content that's come out in the meantime, Extreme Trials Dungeons, the usual stuff. And I think we've got a pretty good grasp on what is working about this and what is not working about this. So I want to share with you my thoughts on how I think it's turned out and what direction I think they honestly need to go in the future. Now, TLDR, or I guess watch in this case, I never really agreed with this design decision for a number of reasons. I expressed concerns right after the media tour, but of course decided to give them a chance. I understood what their goal was. They wanted to make these buff window timings uniform, so that way players of all skill levels could understand, hey, every 2 minutes, I'm going to press all these skills and do a bunch of damage. It was supposed to lower the skill ceiling a bit and even raise the skill floor to try to bring all levels of play closer together while just making it easier to balance jobs in theory. Now, that's all well and good, and on paper, that makes absolute sense, but I don't think that it achieved that goal entirely. It definitely did a little bit, but I think that the cost of achieving that was quite steep. Now, I think most people, myself included, expressed a bit of concern over homogenization of job design. If every job is focused around these 1-minute personal buff windows and then 2-minute big buff windows, well then, how do you fill in the space in between and make sure that every job actually has kind of a fair shot at making use of those windows? I don't actually think the homogenization became as much of a problem as I was expecting. I've played 6 or 7 different jobs seriously in endgame content at one point or another since the launch of Endwalker, and I do get a distinct feeling on each job that accessing my power is different. But when you get to those 1 and 2 minute windows, it becomes a lot about how you got into that 1 and 2 minute window and what resources did you have saved up, and the kind of thinking behind it is homogenized for most of the jobs. But the actual play, I don't think this was as much of a negative as I was expecting, but it definitely leads in that direction, and people are constantly afraid of that. So it would be remiss of me to not mention that that's a factor. No, for me, the negatives are far different and I think far more impactful on this decision. And again, we've come to see that after enough raid tiers. I don't need to give it till the end of the expansion. They may make changes mid-expansion that would affect this opinion, but let's get into the different elements that I think don't work and really need to be addressed going into future patches or expansions. For me, my biggest problem is job design rigidity. Whereas homogenization was the initial fear, being stuck on these 1 and 2 minute timers lead to very specific global cooldown timings and rotational rhythm that if you do not match that, your buff windows suffer immensely. Now, that is technically true of the design of the jobs prior to Endwalker, but you are now on a very strict schedule that can be affected by so many different aspects of an encounter or making a mistake and dying that it feels twice as bad as it ever did to make a mistake or to be killed off randomly because there was not enough healing or you stood in the wrong spot or whatever the reason may be. It also puts a lot more pressure on players to perform well within these windows and more punishment for not doing so, because creating those damage outliers is how you really move your DPS total up. Because of all the pressure and the rigidity, entering a burst window on the right global cooldown, the exact one that you have practiced and gotten familiar with, is far more crucial to the success of your play than it was in the past. It also makes things like delaying buffs more annoying and tougher for some jobs. Buffs during boss mechanics are more difficult to line up and use, which leads to people wanting to delay, but then it not feeling good, so the issue becomes compounded on itself. And of course, deaths. If you have a poorly timed death, you are ruined most of the time for the entirety of the encounter. You are going to struggle so much with that element in particular that it's just you're gonna just want to wipe. You're not even gonna want to continue the pull some of the times, because even if you do, you're just at such a huge disadvantage if it just happens to fall on the wrong time. Now, any player struggling with any of these elements, getting in on the right GCD, making sure they have the exact time for it, not drifting the buff at any point in the fight, not understanding the delay of buffs if they need to be delayed at certain. If you struggle with any aspect of those 2-minute buff windows and their strictness, then you're going to find yourselves burdening your parties more than you mean to. And sometimes it's not even going to be on purpose. It's not even going to be a skill issue. Sometimes it's just completely out of your hands, and that doesn't feel good. It's one of those cases where, yes, if I was sitting there hitting a dummy every 2 minutes, I know how to line things up. It's beautiful. But the mastery of getting it right in encounters where those clean cases don't present themselves isn't as satisfying as it should be. You're just trying to make sure that nothing falls apart more than anything. Now, this in turn leads to other issues. One of the big ones being the strength of buff windows, being the strength of the job. There are a bunch of jobs that have decent party utilities, party buffs, whatever you may have. But if your job cannot capitalize on 2 minutes to the point where it has competitive DPS with other jobs, it can make or break the job. And this means that job changes that affect 2-minute buff windows are way more swingy for a job's balance as well. Whereas buffing the more consistent DPS tools, things like your basic 1-2-3 combo, are nice for your floor, how much damage you'll deal outside of those buff windows, but do not again help create that outlier that really brings your numbers up in total. The worst part about that is, even if you play your job well, the job by default needs to be adequately equipped to keep pace with the rest of the party during this crucial burst window. For me, a great example is Red Mage. For a long time, people have kind of accepted that Red Mage isn't the highest DPS caster. It's generally considered easy to play, it does decent DPS, it's got a party buff, it's got a defensive buff, it's got a res. On paper, it looks amazing. It's like, it might do a little less damage, but we don't need it. But unfortunately, with the recent raid tier, it's now under a great deal of criticism because it doesn't make use of 2-minute windows as well, and its baseline DPS, its floor, does not make up for that across the entirety of the fight. It's the same with machinists, who are often discriminated against not only for keeping pace with other jobs or not keeping pace with other jobs, but also not having any utility. So they really fall into the gutter when they can't make use of the stronger jobs to make themselves perform better. Meanwhile, on the flip side, if you look at Samurai, a job that has classically struggled a bit because it has no utility and is meant to just be a DPS bot, is not really struggling right now to find parties, to find play. It's a popular choice because it's consistent and able to make use of its buff windows incredibly reliably. So that strength is proving to be something that even the best of raid buffs cannot overcome. As long as people are getting their 5% buff, have a few utilities like Feint and Addle and the range physical reduction, whatever the healers and tanks are bringing, people just want you to be able to pump during those 2 minutes and have high overall numbers. And that's not the healthiest thing for the game. Now, with the strength of buff windows really determining the strength of the job, it kind of compounds on another issue Final Fantasy XIV has had for a long time, and that's damage variance in buff windows being too high. This is because crit and direct hit, for as long as either of those stats have been in the game, have been super strong. And, you know, if you don't land a crit versus you do land a crit on a big skill, then that can make or break how your overall fight actually goes. You might clear regardless of the result, but in those early weeks where the DPS checks are far more tight, you're going to feel like, oh, didn't crit that skill, I guess we're dead. And nobody wants to feel that way. With 2-minute windows being so do or die now, though, it's just that bad direct hit or crit RNG can just create what I consider unhealthy gaps in minimum and maximum performance, even if you were to play exactly the same way in two different pulls. I just don't think that's the way to do things. And then there's something that just kind of personally annoys me. I do think there are some positives to this, but I have to make note that since regulating buff windows at 2 minutes, the devs really like putting mechanics that either have downtime or force the party to go to completely different sides of the room almost every time there's a 2-minute buff window. It's eerily consistent how often they've done this in this expansion, and I don't like it. It just makes the rigidity of those job rotations during 2 minutes feel worse. You either lose a GCD, fall out of your rhythm, or you just have to delay buffs, and we all know how bad that feels after I mentioned it earlier. It's annoying that it happens so consistently. Now, I did say there was one small positive to this, and it's that I've seen a lot more regulated strats amongst Savage encounters, Extreme encounters, and even Ultimate encounters that try to circumvent this. And it's great to see the player base actively coming up with strategies that make it easier to pull off buffs during buff windows. Again, I think this is actually the one good thing here, but I can't help but be annoyed at the seemingly intentional design clash of giving you regulated buffs and then saying, but by the way, the boss is going to make sure that that's not really a great time to do it. So overall, I'm not a big fan of it. I said that at the start of the video, but I think now you can understand kind of the depths of it. And to be honest, I haven't even covered all the points. I've been listening to some of my peers talk about it, and we all seem to have different sticking points that are more or less annoying to us. So I'd really just highlighted the ones that were most annoying or most egregious to me. But the big question becomes, what is the solution going forward? And realistically, there are two different solutions, and I'm definitely going to prefer the latter one that I'm going to discuss here. So choice number one is to address certain issues while still keeping the 2-minute buff windows as the overall design. For me, the job rigidity is probably the big thing to tackle. Having played Monk and Dancer in this expansion, and then having played things like Bard or Ninja, I feel like when I'm playing Monk and Dancer, I'm playing jobs that, yes, there is that like optimal global cooldown to enter your buff window in, and there's that ideal 2-minute window that you're trying to achieve. But you have this flexibility that it feels like other jobs don't have. If you are to make a mistake, or if you were to die or anything like that, there's ways to come back into the fight that don't feel like you're completely griefing everything or that everything is thrown off. It still depends on when you die, but at the same time, it's at least better. Whereas with jobs like Bard or Ninja, I can be just completely thrown off and have to hold off using entire skills for periods of time that if I don't, then it's just misaligned with what everybody else wants to do for the remainder of the fight. Heck, it's even misaligned with what I want to do with my own skills for the rest of the fight. And that is just not good. So if they can address the rigidity design but keep the 2-minute buff windows, I think that does some things to alleviate the issue. And I think we're going to start to see that kind of addressed maybe in 6.3. Paladin's being reworked, and if we're going to talk about jobs that are rigid, the fact that I haven't mentioned Paladin up till now is kind of insulting, but I didn't want to bring it up. So here we are now, though. We get to see if they address that issue properly in 6.3. If they do not, and Paladin still feels way too rigid, then we're going to have an issue, and we're going to have this discussion again, because I don't think it'll have gotten through all the way. But I don't think that's the route they should take, but I do think that's the route they're more likely to take. The route that I said that I would prefer is to do a bit of a design reversion. I think it was better when we had more of these kind of 30-second PowerPoints like we had in Shadowbringers and before, where, you start the fight, everyone has, 30-second skills, 1-minute skills, 90-second skills, 2-minute skills, even, I think we even had 2.5, and then of course we had a couple of 3-minute skills in there, and those become the focus of the initial part of the fight. But then every 30 seconds is another PowerPoint that people can capitalize on. If you make a mistake or you miss something, you can realign for another buff window that's not completely in line with every single buff window. A great example is a 2-minute buff window is fairly strong, and a 3-minute buff window for some jobs was, something that they were going to do. But then the 6-minute buff window was crazy strong. It was basically like the opener of the fight, instead of every 2 minutes being like the opener of the fight. So you can move things around. It was more fluid to try to move buffs around like that. But what it did is it created a much bigger gap between the people with a low capacity. They were basically sitting at the skill floor, and people who could perform at the skill ceiling. It created a wider gap. but it also made it so that there was more room for improvement as an individual player. And I personally value that over the regulation of the 2-minute buff windows. I'm not saying that you need to completely destroy the new players or the less skilled players and their experience, but there are benefits, pros and cons to these things that need to be weighed. And after having this time with the 2-minute buff windows, I don't think the pros have outweighed the cons enough to say this is the definitive way to go forward. So I would like to see that kind of reversion that allows people to express themselves a little bit more in their gameplay and in their buff understanding, and allows more skilled groups to more adeptly use these types of buff windows and place them strategically in encounters depending on the length, versus just deciding if maybe we want to hold 2s here because we're only going to get 4 2s, or maybe we do 5 2s if we get it. That's pretty much the end of the decision making, and it always leads to some really jank thing happening at some point, and it never feels good. So I just don't want to have to do that ever again. I'm looking at you, P4S, because you're definitely one of the ones that make me feel this way. Now, I do want to express one last thought before I wrap up this video, and it's in regards to the overall game's balance. Despite what you're hearing from me in this video and what you may hear from other creators or people in the space, the game is relatively well balanced. Just looking at the output numbers, Monk and Machinist are about 10 to 12% apart, depending on if you're talking about a median or an upper percentile. And those are two completely different roles. You know, Machinist within its own role is only a few hundred points off across the median and above. Generally, the upper percentiles being where the differences are really more made. The thing is not about the numbers being close and not being that off balance. It's about the community perception of these jobs versus where they place in these numerical standings. A machinist is a job that doesn't offer a lot of utility. So even if it's within a couple hundred points of Dancer, Dancer brings a ton of utility to the table. And a lot of that utility is what enables its damage to be as high as it is. So Machinist, as perceived by the community, should be able to offer more than that because it doesn't have the other utilities. So the big point I'm trying to make here is that you're going to hear a lot of opinions and whatnot thrown around. And it's important to note that while I can say at times we're making mountains out of molehills, it's also not something that should be ignored just because the balance is close, because the way the community perceives these things is very, very important. Again, Samurai is a great example. Doesn't have any utilities, is in no way really shunned by the community at all because its performance matches what it brings. Should Monk be higher than it? Probably not. And in some cases it is, some cases it isn't. You know, it's so close that it's not really clear to say one is better than the other. And that's kind of true across all of the melees except for maybe Reaper. But the point is that you can be a job that doesn't perform at the absolute top and still be considered by the community to be in a good spot. And I think that these 2-minute buff windows lead to discrepancies that cause the community to perceive things the way that they do. And I, again, hope they kind of go back a little bit more to the Shadowbringers design over the Endwalker design. That being said, it is a huge discussion, again, with more points than I've even brought up in this video. So I would ask that you continue the discussion in the comment section of the video below and let me know what you think about the 2-minute buff windows. Are you for it? Are you against it? Or what would you like to see different? With that, thank you for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care.